Hey, everybody. My name is Colin LeBeau, and I am the president here at Fox Hire, Employer of Record Service. We are an employer of record platform in the United States that supports staffing, recruiting, and employers of all types, but specifically in the healthcare staffing industry. And we're excited today to present a webinar about avoiding credential fraud. It's a very hot topic, and we've got our fantastic Jamie Henry here, who is our in-house expert on everything healthcare that is going to lead us down this path. Jamie's been with us for a couple of years now and has really brought a ton of expertise from the healthcare space out of Akron Children's Hospital and many years of service in healthcare. So welcome, Jamie.
Thank you, Colin.
Yeah,
like Colin said, we are really excited to be able to discuss this topic today. So thank you for taking some time to join us. A little bit about myself, like Colin said, my background is in healthcare. So I do have a nursing license. So I have been on both sides of the credentialing process. So I have gone through extensive credentialing for personal employment and been responsible for the credentialing process for lots of different role types in the healthcare industry. Colin, can you go ahead and advance us to the next slide? I do apologize, everyone. We have some technical difficulties today, so Colin's going to be helping with the slide advancement for us. So
yeah, and I'll just add before we get started, we are going to take questions at the end, so feel free to populate those questions in the Q&A box, which should be at the bottom of your webinar Zoom navigation screen. You can also chat the group if you'd like. Would love to hear where people are calling in from in the chat. And would love to see some healthy conversation there if you are interested. So both of those things are available before we get started, but without delay, Jamie, take it away.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so today, like I said, we're going to talk about credentialing fraud, and we'll start with just a basic definition, although I'm going to assume that most of you are all too familiar with exactly what we worry about here. So we'll talk a little bit about what credentialing fraud is, the negative ways in which it can impact our business, and then spend the bulk of our time focusing on those practices that you can do starting today to really improve your credentialing process, right? So credentialing is something that we've all done for years, but with the advancements in technology, it's easier than it ever was before for candidates to pass off fraudulent licenses and certifications. But that same technology actually makes it easier for us to catch those things as well. So what we'll talk about today is really how those practices have advanced and the things you can do to build in layers that really create a safety net for your business. So if you want to move to the next slide, please, Colin. You can go ahead and skip right over that one too. All right, credentialing fraud. So at its most basic level, credentialing fraud is just the practice by which documents are fraudulently created or modified to indicate that an individual has completed training, education, licensing, certification, lots of different things that they can modify to present themselves as being qualified for a certain type of role. And obviously in healthcare, because there is so much that's required for these roles, there's lots of opportunity for these types of fraud to occur. Next slide. All right, so I was being a little dramatic here, right? Ripped from the headlines, but unfortunately it's true. So, just at the beginning of this year, you saw all over the media, about the fraudulent nursing degree scheme that was occurring in Florida and some other areas. So this is actually the title from the Office of Inspector General, so the OIG, related to that scheme. So fraudulent nursing diploma scheme leads to federal charges against 25 defendants. And these numbers are actually a little bit outdated. So since that post was made, it's actually grown. But at the time, we were looking at roughly 7,600 plus fake nursing diplomas and transcripts. They're actually issued by the universities. So that gets pretty scary. But again, there are ways to still avoid getting caught in that. And we'll get to that in a little bit. But it led to 25 individuals with federal indictments, and then 5 states. And again, I know for sure that's grown because Ohio has been impacted. That's where we're located. So it's up to significantly more states than that. And the Office of Inspector General, which is part of the Department of Health and Human Services, this was pulled specifically from their site. But there were lots of other agencies and associations that called attention to it as well. So just a few here: Department of Justice, the American Nurses Association, which is the largest professional organization for nurses in the United States, the National Council for the State Boards of Nursing, so the council for all of the state boards of nursing. I didn't go to every individual state board of nursing, but if you do a quick Google search, you'll see many of them have statements on their websites right now too, warning of being careful for fraud. And then the Department of Veteran Affairs, which, excuse me, one of the reasons I called attention to that is they're actually one of the largest employers of nurses, as well as PT, OT, speech, and other disciplines in the US. So they've also drawn attention to the need for credentialing practices. Next slide. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. So I think we may have missed one in there, I apologize, but it basically just listed, yep, there we go, all the different media outlets that covered the story. And as you can see, like it was print, it was online, it was, in broadcast news reports. And it wasn't just in the US, BBC reported on it. The World Health Organization had a statement on it. I mean, it was definitely getting very broad coverage. And I think the reason being is this was one of the most sophisticated schemes that's been identified so far, in that it wasn't just the process by which an individual fraudulently made documents. There was a large-scale involvement from universities to produce these documents on those individuals' behalf. So you can go ahead to that next one now, Colin. Oh, that's fine. Yep, we're good right there. So basically the next point I was going to make is that that's just the tip of the iceberg. This is the one that got caught. There are lots of other schemes out there, and nursing's not the only discipline where we see this. And in fact, nursing has some of the most sophisticated practices in place for license verification and reconciliation. So if this is happening in nursing, where those checks are already in place, you can definitely make the assumption that we are seeing this in other areas as well. Hey, Colin, I think we moved off the presentation. There we go. All right, if you want to go ahead and skip to the next slide for me, please. So what's the impact, right? And some of these are pretty obvious. So the first one, that next slide, Colin, is just safety. So if you have individuals who haven't completed the appropriate training and certification or education, they're not prepared to do the job. So you have that risk of possible injury, of neglect, psychological harm, and even possibly death. So, all of those things can come back on the employer, the agency, anybody who would have been responsible for credentialing that candidate for the role. Next slide. And there's financial costs associated with that as well. So obviously any claims that might be made against your malpractice or liability as a result of somebody who was not prepared to do the job. And in the event that there is a claim and it's found that that person wasn't adequately licensed for the role, there's the potential for loss of your insurance coverage as well. Then you've got, obviously the money you've already sunk into recruiting and vetting that person if they're not able to continue practicing. You can have clients refuse to pay. We see language in contracts all the time that puts the onus back on us as the employer of record or on the recruiter, and ensuring that that candidate is prepared to do the job. And if not, they basically are claiming right for, to have non-payment on those services if in fact that individual doesn't have what's required for the role. And then in addition, depending on what's required as far as investigation, you could have costs for the investigation, legal fees, and possibly even fines. Next slide, Colin. And then while this seems like a lesser impact, reputation, that negative word of mouth, I would encourage everybody to think about the highly digital age that we live in and how fast and far information can travel. So it only takes, one negative media story or posting on, LinkedIn or Twitter or anything else for it to go viral. And certainly, especially now, with the attention that fraud has, people are looking for these stories and sharing this information in an effort to help all of us keep each other safe. So definitely a time to be really focused on your reputation, and not just on preventing damage to your reputation, but looking at this as an opportunity to really build your reputation as somebody who has really solid credentialing practices and ensures that you're delivering qualified candidates to your clients every time.
Yeah, and I would just add, I asked the question when we first started this section about if anybody saw this in the news. I know the chat was disabled, but I was able to enable the chat. So would love to see if anybody else besides Matt had seen this. I saw it on social media, and there was a lot of like laughter and like, oh my gosh, how could that be possible, right? But like in the Facebook group specifically for recruiting companies and healthcare recruiting organizations, there was a lot of talk about this and a lot of concern and questions and were any of my candidates affected? And there are quite a few well-known schools that were sort of caught up in this that people had been using, so or at least people that had been finding candidates from. So I would love to hear any feedback from others here on the call if you saw it on social media or in the news, because it was a big story, and so it affected the staffing industry as a whole, not just those schools.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, Colin, interesting point. We saw a contract just 2 weeks ago that has each of those schools listed and says we cannot hire somebody with a degree from one of those institutions. So, and that's unfortunate because there are people who earned their degrees honestly from those institutions before this all occurred, who now can't work under their license, if somebody has written that into a contract. So,
yeah, absolutely. And to give perspective, we look at hundreds of contracts on a monthly basis, MSP, VMS, just directly to an end client in the healthcare space. And so I don't know if you agree with this, Jamie, but I would suspect we're going to see more of that, as some of these schools come out, but also just a general tightening around credentialing practices and who takes on the risk of credentialing, and speaking specifically about that in the contract, because that's not always listed in every agreement. But I think we're going to see more of that as well, like penalties or other risks that you might have to take on as an agency that's performing credentialing in conjunction with staffing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, to your point, it's strictly anecdotal just based on what we have seen, but we are seeing an increase in the number of client contracts that specify that we have to do, education verification, employment verification, reference checks, which are all parts of that, those layers that we're going to be talking about to create that safety net. So, all right. So again, right, that's what we want to focus on. That's the whole point of this discussion, is how do you keep your business safe? So listed here are the best practices for credentialing. And I'm going to guarantee there's probably nothing on that list that you haven't heard of or done at some point in time. But what I'm going to challenge you to consider is that you may not be doing it in a way that is keeping up with the current opportunities to cheat the system. So we'll talk about how some of these processes have changed and what you can do to really minimize the risk in each one of these areas. But again, no one area is enough to keep you safe. Every single thing listed here, besides possibly that background check, can be hacked, right? Somebody can come up with a way to get around it. But when you put them all together, you really reduce the likelihood that you're going to have somebody who's able to get around each and every one of them. Okay, so starting with license verification. Again, like I said, I think everybody's going to know every one of these processes listed, but this one in particular is really interesting. So license verification is something we probably do with every single licensed placement. And when I say we, I am talking about the collectively, right? Everybody who's attending. If you've made a healthcare placement, I'm going to bet good money you verified that license. And that's because it's easy, right? It's a public record search. So verifying a license is just conducting an online search. Typically, you can contact the offices directly, but I think most of us, excuse me, use online resources today. All you do is go to the site, throw in the candidate's information. It verifies for you that the license exists under that name, that it is in good standing, so meaning there's no sanctions against it, right? It's unencumbered, and it'll typically give you the issue date and the expiration date. But as much as this helps keep you safe and ensuring that that license is good, it's actually a great way for candidates to steal an individual's license. because again, it's a public record search. And remember, when you verify, what you're looking at is public information. Every licensed individual's license is a matter of public record, but that public record is limited. It's just the name, the state, the issue date, the expiration date, right? And then any sanctions against it. It's not the actual license itself. So keep that in mind when we move to the next topic, which is reconciliation. But for this one, just to give you an example, so my maiden name is Smith, so Jamie Smith. It's pretty much an alias, right? About as common as it gets. So, for example, I did a search in Ohio. There are 6 Jamie Smiths in the state of Ohio. 3 of them happen to share my middle initial. So if I wanted to fraudulently present myself as a nurse, I could do a public record search using my name in multiple different states to see if I can find a license number under that name to then present as my own. And this happens. This is actually very common. I'll give you a couple of examples on the next slide. But that information, because it's public record, can easily be found by anybody who's searching for it. And with the increase in the number of compact states, the number of states that somebody has to find a license in has grown. So if anything, this has become an increased area of opportunity, which is why for every license you verify, you should also reconcile it. So that column is on our, excuse me, on our next slide. I apologize, the pollen's gone wild in Ohio. My voice is not happy about it. So license reconciliation. So this is a little different. What we find is even a lot of our experienced recruiters don't really know the difference between verifying a license and reconciling a license. This will probably be your most important takeaway today from our discussion. So reconciliation is the process by which you tie a license to a specific individual. There's actually a service through nurses, so NURSYS, which is probably a service most of us use if we're verifying a nurse's license. They have a special service called e-Notify. You do have to register as an organization to access it, but it is free. And this service will take and verify the name and license number that you collect from the individual against the last 4 of their social security and their year of birth. So when you are onboarding a nurse and going to verify and reconcile their license, when you collect all of that information, you take and you feed it all into your e-Notify database. It will both verify that license for you for all those things that we talked about before, and then it's going to reconcile it. It's going to tell you if that license belongs to the person with the date of birth and social security information that you put in. We implemented this back in 2021, I think the very end of 2021. And we actually have it integrated with our platform. So we have, a homegrown software. So it's not an out-of-the-box ATS, but e-Notify does have integration opportunity with those as well. And what's really cool about this is it doesn't just increase your safety, it really saves you time. So when we're onboarding somebody, they're already giving us name, date of birth, social security. There's one additional field where they type in their license number. All of that feeds over to our integration and will then spit back the information directly into our system and save that for us with a date and time stamp that lets us know if there's anything flagging on that license that is of concern. That automatically comes by email to my team to review. And it doesn't just do it upon hire, it does it every 24 hours for every state that that nurse is licensed in. So if you hire that nurse to work in Ohio and that nurse happens to be licensed in 6 other states, it's checking all of those other state licenses as well. We have actually caught 2 individuals in the past year and a half trying to present themselves under somebody else's license using this integration. So if you do nothing else today, go to e-Notify, register your organization. If you can't do the integration, it's still a super useful tool. But if you're able to integrate, it just takes it one step further for you. So good information there. Now,
I'm going to put that in the chat, everybody, this link.
Perfect.
Will get you there. Definitely would say take advantage of that. Jamie, we have water coming your way also.
Oh my gosh, thank you. I'll be right back.
So Vicky should let you in some water.
Thank you.
I'm your MC until she gets back. But would love to get some feedback on that tool. And if you've ever heard of that before, would love to hear you say yes in the chat. If you have not heard of eNotify before, would love to see that in the chat as well. Because I think that's a really great suggestion. And as Jamie said, it's integrated into our platform. So we're doing this on behalf of the recruiting firms that partner with us. But would love to get some feedback on it if anybody has used this before, or if they're only using Nurses, the normal product.
Thank you, Colin. I appreciate the coverage there. Okay, now for those disciplines that don't have the sophistication that the nursing licensing boards do yet, I suspect it's coming, but for those areas like PT, OT, speech, the things we can't verify that way yet, the best method for reconciliation in those cases is to request a copy of the license. When you get that copy of the license, you're looking for a couple specific things. You want to see either a seal or a QR code. There should also be a signature from the licensing body. And there should be, in the event that it's like some of the states no longer issue paper licenses, they should be able to log into their portal and access a copy of their license there. We have had people tell us before that, you know, they don't even get like a hard copy in their portal, and that's fine. What we always say is just send us a screenshot that shows you logged in to your unique account within that board within that licensing board. Send us a picture of it from there, and we can accept that, because again, only that individual would have that level of access. Okay, Colin, you can jump to that next slide. So just briefly, do's and don'ts, and we've already touched on some of this, right? So do verify and reconcile every license. If a candidate tells you they don't have a copy, direct that candidate to the professional licensing board to have another copy issued. And don't feel bad doing that. I understand that candidates push back, but we're all taught in school that we have a responsibility to carry a copy of our license. So new copies can always be obtained by the license holder. They may have to pay a nominal fee, but that fee they incur is worth keeping you safe. And if they do push back, remind them that this extra safety step is for them as well. So, you know, those 2 nurses that we caught in this past year and a half, not the applicants themselves, but the actual individuals who held those licenses, we helped keep their licenses safe because we took that extra step. So the don'ts are pretty simple too, right? Don't use verification in place of reconciliation. They're not the same. Don't accept a copy of a verification as a copy of a license. We have candidates try to submit that all the time. We have to explain why it's not the same and send them back for the copy of that license. And then lastly, don't accept a copy of a license with a previous name. So we see this pretty frequently too, typically related to either marriage or divorce. It's fine to take it with the previous name as long as the employee can submit formal documentation, legal documentation, explaining the name change. Okay, so this is just an example of a copy of a license and what you should be looking for, right? So here I have highlighted the QR code, the signatures. I do want to point something out real quick. So I made this just to give you the image to look for those things. And as I was doing it, I realized you can't really pull these images from the web. So I used my own license. And then I realized I really don't want my personal license in a presentation. So Colin will attest to the fact that my technological skills are not among my strengths. And still in less than 5 minutes, I was able to use Nitro PDF writer to go in and change my own documents. So you can see here, I zeroed out my nursing license. I took my name out and put sample nurse name. Colin, if you advance to the next slide. That's the wallet card version. This is the wall hanging version. Did the same thing here. I just snipped the center of my QR code, but you can still see it's there, right? It's got all the information. It looks official, except I was able to zero out my license number. I was able to change my name and address. So it's just a good example of how easy it is to fraudulently alter a document.
Yeah, and Jamie, got a question from Shamika here. She's asking, what does the QR code bring up if you were to follow that link?
That's a great question. So it should take you back to the Board of Nursing, I believe. Again, we don't use those for that purpose, so I can't say for sure. That's a great question. I'd be happy to go test it with my own after this, and we can send that out. Colin, we have the email addresses of everybody who attended, right? So we can do that. Yeah, I'd be happy to do that as follow-up. I'll go follow one of mine after this and let you guys know what happens with it. And this is only on newer licenses. So I will tell you that the ones that I've had issued in the past few years have those QR codes, but like my very first license from the state of Ohio does not. So it's not on all licenses yet, but we'll let you know what it does. Okay, so on to the next topic. So education and employment verification comes back full circle to the beginning of the conversation around the issues that were happening with those universities in Florida, right? But education verification is still important. Again, it wouldn't have caught those cases because of the way the fraud occurred, but it's one of the layers. So one of the biggest things I would recommend for education verification is use a service. Universities are slow to respond. It can be tough to get through the layers. It takes a lot of manpower. Using a service takes that all off your plate. When you do the verification, you actually want to try to get transcripts as well. So that's the other piece of it, right? Like you don't necessarily want a copy of the diploma, you want transcripts, which is what a service is going to ask for. And you want to get them directly from the university, not from the employee. And again, that's all in an effort to prevent receiving fraudulent documents. When you're doing an employment verification, we recommend verifying directly with the employer. Again, we do use a service for this. It's because they have the ability to make multiple attempts, all of which are documented, and to make sure that when they get through, it's to the appropriate party, and they obtain for us typically the dates of employment, the title, and eligibility for rehire are the big things that we focus on. What I recommend that you don't do is accept copies of transcripts or diplomas specifically, from the candidate. And again, that's just because they're so easy to create. We also recommend not using a resume or a reference as proof of employment. We have talked to recruiters in the past who will often tell us that we don't need to do an employment verification because they've talked directly with the references, and that's not really viewed the same. So we still recommend checking references, but employment verification should be done separately. All right, next slide.
Before we jump to that, are there any type of services that you can give, like any vendors, or what type of service are you talking about? Like, could you just give some examples maybe?
Yeah, absolutely. So over the years, we've used a couple different ones. Again, the level of sophistication can vary pretty widely between vendors. So you can do them through, I mean, there's tons of vendors out there, right? Everybody from Accurate, Sterling, Good Hire, GHRR. There's lots and lots of options. If you do a general search, a lot of them will come up. And there's actually some great postings too that will rank the sites against, or the services against each other, and help you identify which one's the right fit for you. So we actually use Sterling, and that's because they offer a full suite of services. So they can do like all of our employee health services that we need as well. So tuberculosis testing, titers, et cetera. And their technology is just a little more advanced. So one of the things that they're able to do with employment and education verification is collect it directly in the portal. So it cuts out the step that ends up being manual work typically for the agency, or in our case, the employer of record, where we're having to collect that information from the employee as far as their past employers or the institutions they've attended, and entering all of that into the system to be verified. It just directs the employee there, has the employee enter everything and sign the release for that information to be sent. So lots of different opportunities, but we would tell you that so far that's been a great service for us.
Yeah, for sure. The integration makes it a lot easier for us to leverage and makes that flow automated. So we really appreciate that from our vendor.
Yeah, absolutely. So professional reference check. This is probably the oldest method that we have of verifying somebody's credentials, right? But I would tell you it's still one of the best. And I highly recommend that you do it. And the nice thing about reference checks is it is one of the few things that you can do before making an offer. So when you're going through the candidate screening process, ask that candidate for references. And ideally, these should be professional references. I typically recommend a minimum of 2. They should always be past supervisors. So not necessarily past coworkers, right? Not always going to give the most trustworthy reviews of somebody's performance. So 2 past supervisors. For somebody who doesn't have a lengthy employment history yet, you can have them use a personal reference in addition to 1 professional reference and still get good information that way. When you do a reference check, highly recommend that you get the professional email and work phone number for that individual. And then before you make the call to that person, verify either on the company's website or through LinkedIn that the person is, employed at that institution by that name in that role or a similar role, and that the contact information that you were given matches. And then when you do the reference check, ideally, if you can do it by phone, it gives you the opportunity to really ask a lot of questions, get some clarifying information. Remember that this isn't employment verification. This person volunteered to be a reference, so they can talk a little more freely. You can ask about the individual's clinical skills, what type of area, if they worked in any sort of specialty areas, those sorts of things. This is your opportunity to get that information verified by an individual that worked with that person. And then after you do the phone call, follow up with an email thanking that person. So now you have ensured that if they gave you a phone number that didn't match, you're following up with the email that should, right? So just a way to verify that you've got the correct person there. What we recommend that you don't do is accept letters of recommendation in place of a reference check. Again, those can be falsified, right? Again, don't use personal email and phone for all the reasons we just discussed. And then don't accept references from individuals not in a supervisory role. So the exception to that would be, somebody with a very short professional experience, maybe 1 supervisor, 1 coworker, but outside of that, it should be supervisors only. All right, resumes. So this is probably the other one that we've all been doing forever, right? But over the years, resumes have shrunk in size. At some point, we went from a resume really being a chance to sell yourself down to trying to get it down to a 1-pager, right? Well, in healthcare in particular, it's not a fit. The work that is done in healthcare is too technical and too specialized, oftentimes by area, to be condensed down to a single page. So I would encourage you, when you're requesting resumes, to ask specifically that the individuals list their past employers with dates of employment, and that they detail for you the skill sets utilized. The other thing you can ask is what professional organizations they've been in. Again, what you're trying to find out here is if somebody's misrepresenting themselves, it's going to be harder for them to do this, right? They're not necessarily going to have the knowledge to fake that information for you. And then you can use that resume during your interview process to dig deeper. Tell me more about whatever it is that they have listed. Get them talking and make sure that what they say sounds right for the role. People who don't really have the full experience, this is where a lot of times you're going to catch it. They're just going to sound like they don't really know what they're talking about, or it doesn't quite line up with what you would expect to hear given the area that they worked in or the type of work that they were doing. The don't, I actually thought about this after I put it here. I was like, I think that maybe is some advice that needs a little bit of clarification. So when I say don't use an application in place of a resume, we've actually seen some pretty fantastic applications that really drill down and get to the specifics. So if that's what your application does, keep using it, and we'd love to see your template, quite honestly. So that's just a little bit of advice there. As long as you're using it to get the right information, an application can work really well. All right, next slide. Okay, competency assessments. I always hesitate a little bit to bring this one up. They're never popular with your candidate, and they can be challenging, although they've come a really, really long way. So a competency assessment is used to measure knowledge or skill in a given area. this used to be something highly specific to nursing, but it has grown tremendously, especially over the past few years, as I think we've really had the pandemic heighten our awareness of the importance of supporting roles like respiratory therapy and speech, OT, PT, you name it. So there's a lot more available than there used to be in this area. And the pandemic also really moved a lot of these services online. So it's now possible to find online competency assessments, both for knowledge and skill. And a lot of them are even like highly specific to areas of practice. Like, I mean, we saw one the other day for traumatic brain injury, which was surprising to me. It's just something that I wouldn't necessarily think of as fitting into those molds, but it just gives you an example of exactly how detailed you can get now. And there are a lot of services such as MedTrainer, CEU 360, and I think there are a couple others as well where you can build your own competencies within their platform. So if there's something really specific you want, you can create that to have in your own library. So something to think about if you have a client that's asking for that highly specialized kind of assessment. But basically, so these are, like I said, great options for measuring knowledge, which is typically in like a question and answer. Some of the other ones that are looking to measure like competency, they have different flexible ways that you can do that for skill sets. So again, I would highly encourage you, if you're looking for that, reach out to those resources. They'll hop on with you, do a demo, walk you through the different offerings, and show you all the things that currently exist and what they can build for you based on what you need.
Yeah, and I would just ask, you mentioned MedTrainer and CEU 360. If anybody else has vendors that they use, share with the group. Would love to see that in the chat as well.
And some of those can get pretty pricey too, but depending on what you need, it's worth it, right? There's also some really simple options. Probably the most simple and cost-effective that we have found is rn.com, which is actually part of AMN, but you can use it without being under contract with AMN, right? It's independent, but it's super easy to use. So both in terms of assigning the assessments and then taking the assessments. And the reason I would encourage you to consider a platform versus something homegrown is that oftentimes they have features built in, like the tests are timed, which is, I think that's a pretty common one. But some of them now have the ability to tell if somebody's opening different browsers while they're taking it, and it will shut the test down and mark it as failed. So again, it's just a way of ensuring that the competency that you're assessing is that individual's knowledge base versus what they're able to look up. So definitely give it some thought. To me, of all the things that you can increase your spend on, competency assessment, while it looks pricey, is worth every bit of it. So, all right, so background checks. I won't spend too much time here because I know we're probably all doing them. My assumption is we're also all using a vendor to do them. You pretty much have to. But what I would encourage you to consider is the background check you're doing enough? Or should you be adding other things to it? So in healthcare, at a minimum, I would suggest adding System for Award Management, so SAM, and Office of Inspector General, which is OIG. Those are free checks that if your background vendor doesn't offer them as a part of your package, you can do them yourself. They take a little bit of time, but they're not too tough. SAM is actually one that you can run an integration with, and I'm trying to remember. I think that one was actually pretty easy for us. So SAM is an integration that can be set up. And again, it's one that you can have run on a timed basis. So we run it upon hire and then monthly as well. So if somebody's added to that list while they're under your employment, you're going to see it. So that's a nice feature to have. But again,
yeah,
most of
it was an easier integration for us.
It was one of the easier ones, yeah.
Yeah.
So again, those types of checks are typically offered through your vendors as well, and they're not expensive. They're a couple dollars a piece, and it's worth it in order to catch something. And we have had things come up on OIG before, and we've had things that we wouldn't have necessarily caught on a license check because they had occurred when the person was like a CNA, and now they're a respiratory therapist or those types of things. So good additional check to add. And there's lots of other ones in the healthcare space, right? FDA department, GSA, faces. I mean, there's just lots and lots of opportunities there to improve your background check process. The other thing we recommend too is that background checks aren't just for the hiring process. Consider running those on a routine basis as well. So for us, they're typically rerun on an annual basis, or if the person has a break in employment. So if they've been with us, they don't have an assignment for a while, and then they come back, we'll run that background check again, just to keep everything clean and consistent. And again, find a provider you like, stick with that provider. So, all right, so everything we've talked about, right, all comes down to time and money, which are the two things that our clients are always pushing on us, right? Move faster, keep the cost down. Not easy to do. But when you consider the potential cost of possibly placing somebody that has fraudulent credentials, it's worth the little bit upfront. And what I would argue is that most of these things, if done right, don't take that much extra time. And while there's some extra cost, it's not a lot, especially if you do repeat placements with your candidates. So if you're moving them from one assignment to the next, many of these things carry over and don't have to be done each time, right? So we started with license verification. Again, something we're all probably already doing. It's probably taking you 10 to 15 minutes right now per license, and it's not costing you a thing except your time. Same thing with your license reconciliation. If you are doing that already, maybe 10 to 15 minutes, not costing you a dime. Integrate with nurses, those things won't take you any time anymore and still won't cost you anything either. So keep that in mind. Education verification. We do it, so for both that and employment verification, I have up to 10 days, but here's the thing. That's really largely dependent on two things. One of them you can control, one of them not as much, right? So the part you can control is the employee's response. So if you're prepping that employee up front that they're going to have to do in education and employment verification, they can be getting that information gathered up because they need to have, those organizations' names, the dates they were there, that type of information that they'll need to complete the form. So have them getting that information ready so that when they receive the form, or if you're using a service that sends them a portal to access, when they receive that access, they can key that all in. It's all complete, which means those verifications can run. And I know typically our turnaround time, they quote 3 to 5 business days. Probably 9 times out of 10, we have it back faster than the 3-day mark even. So the other part of the timing on that is that institution responding. So that university or that employer waiting for their response. This is where I think a service is worth what you pay for, because they're better at getting them to respond because that's all they do. So I think the super fast response times we see are due to their process. So I can tell you, like, the pricing that we pay, that we're quoted for each of those, is $5 per employer or $5 per institution, right around there. It's normally not more than $5 or $6. Where it can get pricey is the universities and the employers have their own fees that they tack on for completing the verification, and those do typically get passed through by the vendor to the person who ordered the test. So there's not really a good way to avoid those unless you want to try to do those verifications yourself. And even then, sometimes you'll still have to pay the fee, that pass-through fee. So look into that as an option for really improving your practice while still saving you some time. Professional reference checks, again, you're probably already doing them, right? If not, and you're adding them in, maybe, we do occasionally have a reference that's hard to get a hold of, and it will extend the timeline on that by a little bit, but not much. So normally 1 to 5 days. Typically, if we make the call by Monday, we normally have contact by Friday. And again, it's not costing you anything more than your time. Resume, probably already collecting them, right? If you ask for them to be a little bit more detailed, you may spend a little more time going over them, but you've also just set yourself up to have a really good interviewing tool. Competency assessments, again, yes, these do add a little bit of time because the candidate does have to get in and get them done. But good prep on your part, making sure the candidate knows that that's going to be part of the process, that they need to set aside the time to get it done, and they understand exactly how much time they will need to complete it, makes it easier for them to fit it into their busy day and get that out of the way for you. And again, cost is anywhere from 7 is about the lowest we've seen. So $7 per module to about 60 plus if you're going to look to build custom content. And then last but not least is your background checks. So 1 to 5 days, again, a lot of that is dependent upon how fast does the employee get in and give their information and sign the release. Typically, once that's done, turnaround's pretty fast, unless you're looking for some of those more challenging counties like Cook County in Illinois that likes to take forever to get you a response, right? Can't control that part. So if you focus on the part you can control, you can cut that timeline down some. And the pricing on there is going to be anywhere, again, between like 22-ish for your standard criminal background check. And then we do have up to 60. And that just, when we go up to 60 on the standard background, it's normally either because they live in counties that have additional surcharges. So like New York has a bunch of those counties. Nevada has a few. There's different areas of the country where we run into that. Or it's because we've opted to add on those sanctions checks, or the GSA and the FDA department and some of those others as well.
Yeah, if I would just add, as you're preparing, thinking about what states you're staffing, and if you have a new state that you're going into, just be mindful of that as you think about your onboarding costs. Because I know New York, is one of those ones that's like pretty expensive, and some other cities and counties. So definitely a good thing to think about as you think about the costs as you set people up.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Colin. All right, so just kind of to summarize, I know a lot of what we touched on today, you probably are familiar with, either because you're currently doing it or you've done it in the past. But really the focus of our conversation today was how it all pulls together. So, it's every one of those pieces of the credentialing process layered together and done in a certain way should really help to weed out any candidates that have maybe been able to obtain a fraudulent copy of a license or fraudulent transcripts. All of those things have a way of sneaking through the cracks. But the more you pull those layers tight, the fewer cracks you have to sneak through. So it's all really about how you pull that together. We recognize that there's time and expense involved. So like I said, we really highly recommend finding a good screening solutions provider that meets your needs, and really working with them on how you can build out packages. We've been able to customize it even down to like certain clients if they have like different requirements for how far back on past employment they want us to go. Our vendor actually is able to package that together. And so when we go into credential somebody, it's one click. We select our package, everything gets assigned. So as you're talking to vendors, find out who's willing to partner with you in that respect. Find somebody who specializes in the staffing industry, because what we do is unique, right? We don't have 3 to 4 weeks to get somebody ready. We need them ready in 1 week or less, right? So there are definitely providers who have more experience in that area than others. Leverage a competency assessment service. I'm not saying you couldn't create a great one on your own. I definitely tried to build a few when I first came here. We quickly realized that based on the need, how fast things were changing, all the extra layers of safety that are offered by these external providers, that felt like the right fit for us. And it's definitely saved us a lot of time too. Register for Nurses eNotify. Can't stress that enough. If you haven't done it yet, go for it. See if you can get that integration on top of it. It's been a huge service for us. And I will tell you too, that's a huge selling point with our clients. It's amazing how often that comes up in conversation with either agencies that we're working with or their clients, that when we explain that there's that continuous monitoring on all those nurses' licenses, we've had clients who actually weren't even aware that have gone and added it for their internal staff now too. So, and if any of you are licensed and you have one for your organization, put your own license in. It monitors all of my licenses for me, which is great because I get my expiration reminders. But it's also a way to help identify if somebody's fraudulently using your license and there's any potential concerns as far as like charges against it. So I'd recommend considering that as well. And then last but not least, if this is still just too much work, right? Which for smaller agencies it can be, or if you're just starting out, or if you are, set up in a fashion that you really can't do some of those searches, consider partnering with another agency or an employer of record that already has those established practices for you.
Yeah, I would totally echo that. I would say, anybody that wants to accomplish scale and achieve, the goal here, which most recruiting agencies want to do two things. They want to sell to clients, and they want to find candidates. Anything that's subtracting your time away from doing that is actually hurting your ability to make money. And so that's why the EOR, or partnering with another agency, is a valuable opportunity for you. Not only are we going to be able to save you time, but we take on all these risks for you. So if you use an EOR, you are not only getting the work done for you, but they take on the risk as well. And so you sort of get a really good value proposition there, along with all the other stuff like payroll, insurance, benefits, compliance. And if you're not sure what an EOR is, would definitely recommend you go to foxhire.com and just check it out. Got a great blog article, What is an Employer of Record? Just sort of understand what that means and how you might be able to leverage it if you want, either for clients that are difficult, for states you're not registered as an employer in, number of different use cases. Would love to talk about that. But Jamie, any other information you want to share with the group before we take questions?
No, I think the only thing I would say is, I know we didn't really touch on credentialing for like physicians, nurse practitioners, PAs. A reason for that being, that is a whole separate hour-plus long conversation. If you're in that space and not currently using a service for credentialing, I highly, highly recommend that you do. And it's just because they're able to do checks that the vast majority of individuals cannot, and even background services like Sterling, Accurate, et cetera, won't have access either. For example, we had physician credentialing, this was just a few months ago now. Part of what they have to do is look at previous medical malpractice claims. And they were able to catch some things on a physician that we were trying to credential that would have been missed if we weren't using a credentialing firm for that purpose. So if that's your space and that's where you are and that's where you're trying to gain knowledge, I highly recommend reaching out to services that specialize in that area.
Agreed. Yep, absolutely. Totally different ballgame there.
Yeah.
Well, we appreciate everybody being here. We hope this was valuable information for you. I'd love to take questions if there are any. You can certainly put that in the Q&A box and or the chat, and we can sit here for a couple minutes to see if anybody would like to ask a question. Go ahead now if you'd like to, and we'll hang out and try to provide some insights for you.
Colin, I should mention too, while we're waiting for questions, for anybody who's currently involved in becoming licensed or is licensed in certain states as a healthcare agency or nursing services pool, they all call it something a little bit different. If you're paying attention to what's happening, they're adding additional layers as far as like what's required for some of these checks. And you'll see that a lot of what they're doing is targeting these same areas that we addressed today, just trying to make sure that there's as many safety measures in place as possible to weed out any possible fraud issues related to licensing, education, et cetera. So if you don't have those practices established yet, you might get nudged that way faster than you're ready for.
Yeah, compliance is always growing. It's never retreating. So as we grow into this space, we're going to continue to have more and more layers. So definitely get familiar with it if you haven't already, or find some partners that can help you with that. I don't have any questions in the Q&A or web chat. So thank you guys so much. We hope you enjoyed this presentation, and we'll go from there. I do have a raised hand here. Let's see. If you would like to ask a question, it should be in the chat. So I did have a raised hand, but if you'd want to ask a question, go ahead in the chat. I'll wait here for another maybe 20 seconds. And then if you can't get that done, happy to follow up via email if you have a question. Okay, sorry about that. I didn't get to see the question. If you do put that in there, we'll definitely follow up with you. Oh, here it is. Okay, Michelle, here we go. So Michelle says, when doing reference checks and verifying the reference supervisor's employment status, am I needing to check on their current employment?
That's a great question. You're definitely going to have references that can't verify current employment, right? That's more so what employment verification is going to be for. And remember, the information is only going to ever be as good as what the employee gives you. So they could be currently employed. And if they don't list that on the employment verification form, that won't be verified. So unfortunately, there's no way to know for sure if somebody's currently employed unless they give you the information and you're able to run the employment verification on it. Or if by chance one of the references they provide for you happens to be their current supervisor. My experience is that's pretty rare, right? A lot of times the current supervisor doesn't necessarily know that that individual is looking. But if they've provided that person as a reference, then you certainly should have the ability to ask them that as a part of the discussion, because typically if they're giving you that person as a reference, they should have given them, the heads up that that call is coming.
Yeah, I hope that was helpful. Any other questions? Okay. Well, hope everybody has a great day. We hope this was a helpful presentation. And again, happy to follow up via email with anybody with questions or interest in Fox Hire. Thanks so much. See you later.